Wanted to make for a while. I've had a lot of discussions about it, and kind of while working through some of the other videos that I recorded for the channel about tying different knots and whatnot, the concepts that we're going to discuss here came up a few times. So hopefully this is an interesting video for you. We're going to talk about how we choose which knot to use with each application. So I've kind of got an assortment of different lures here, mostly bass lures, that we can kind of talk through some specifics, and then just using these bright silver hooks, circle hooks, for most of the discussions around other knots to hooks, etc. I want to preface with, there's a lot of different ways that you could go about this discussion, and one of them would be if X then Y the whole way down. But I'm actually going to kind of take a stance where we're going to talk about why we choose each particular knot for each particular application here instead. All right, so I'm going to start out talking about circle hooks. So when I fish with a circle hook, there's a few different ways you can do it. So really there's a couple different types of knots in general. One would be a kind of a cinched up knot. So this happens to be an improved clinch knot here that we're looking at, but it could be anything, right? This could be a Palomar, this could be a Uni, this could be a San Diego Jam. But what you're going to note is that knot is tight. It's tied snug right there. You see that? Alternatively, you could tie a loop knot, right? As far as I'm concerned, there's really only one loop knot you should be using here, and you can learn how to tie it in one of my other videos. This is the no-slip mono loop, sometimes called the Rapala knot. But as you can see, it's allowing us a lot more movement here. All right. Then on something like a hook explicitly, you can have a snell. Okay. Now I talk about this in my video on tying snell knots, but you want this line to be coming out or going in, depending on how you look at it. But if over here is your main line, you want it to be coming in the front of this eye of this hook, right? And it's easy to see that you want to continue this around in such a manner. Okay, so you're going to want to follow the shape of the hook. Now, for circle hooks, I'll go ahead and tell you right now, if I'm using really big live baits, or if I am using dead bait, or anything that I would consider more heavy tackle, quote unquote, really 90+% of the time, I'm going to be going with a snell. All right, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the snell in this scenario is going to get you a better hookup ratio. All right, and I'll explain why in a moment. The only other knot I would recommend using at times is something like this. So there's types of tuna fishing. There's types of fishing where you're targeting particularly large fish on smaller tackle. Maybe you're using a really, really small, fine live bait, something like a pilchard. Or maybe, you got shad somewhere, or alewife, depending on, if you're kind of in some northern freshwater lake, something like that. There's a lot of different scenarios where you would be using, now this hook would be too big for most of those applications, but maybe you're using a heavier leader with a smaller bait and a smaller hook. In that case, having this extra degree of freedom here, right, is going to allow that bait to move more naturally. All right. Then a cinched up knot to a circle hook, I'll tell you right now, I can't remember the last time. I mean, I worked for years on offshore boats. I do tons of personal fishing, taking friends and family, etc. I can't remember the last time I tied straight to a circle hook like this. I just don't see a lot of reason or opportunity to. I think there's better options. One of the big drawbacks of this is that I will say you're not getting that extra degree of freedom. And we'll talk about how circle hooks in a minute and why that kind of is different than everything else here. But specifically, you can see right here, every little bit that I move this leader, right, it's affecting that hook. If I pick up the leader, the hook moves. If I move the leader to the side, the hook moves. All right, this is 25-pound mono. I took some old mono off of a reel that hasn't been used in a long time, and man, it's even worse. One, you can see the memory here, but everybody knows that mono has memory. But look at this. Even just look at, I'm holding the hook still. It's completely moving. just every little bit of movement that goes in to the main line or the leader here is transmitted to the hook. Now, think about this in reverse, right? Maybe you are fishing, maybe you've got a weight up here somewhere or whatever, and then on this end you've got a live bait trying to move around that you're not getting as much movement. Maybe it's trying to drift naturally in the current and kind of flutter. It's going to be, to some degree, limited, right? You have one less degree of freedom when this is tightly cinched around here. It's not able to move side to side. It's not able to move up and down within the eye. The loop knot solves a lot of that, right? Now look at this. You might think from that previous demonstration, oh yeah, well every time you move the line, the hook moves. Moron, come on. Well, actually, look at this. Look how much I'm moving that line, right? And how little the hook's moving. I mean, the leader's moving all around here. And basically, if you had a little live bait or something on here, you could imagine that even, let's say you had a giant weight right here, really restrictive. Even this, look at how much this hook is free to move without moving the line, okay? So when you're in a scenario where you have a live bait, or like I said, maybe a strip bait or a cut bait or something down there that's fluttering off the bottom, this is gonna be able to move a lot, all right? This is actually one of the areas where I will do a loop knot instead of a snell, especially if I have a live shrimp, all right? Shrimp are relatively small and they don't have a ton of power back there, right? Think of, you hook up a 6-inch mullet for bait, and then you hook up a 4-inch shrimp or something. Well, that shrimp has a lot less of a motor to kick around and look natural, right? So you want him to be as free as possible. Obviously, I'd be using a smaller hook most of the time, especially with the smaller shrimp, but you want this thing to be able to move around, have some flexibility. And then on the snell, you're not going to be getting that much flexibility, but I think the hookup ratio outweighs that. So let's talk about why that's important. When you're using a circle hook, all right, it's pretty obvious this is not the same as a normal J hook. I realize this is a jig head, but you get the same gist. The way this works, the way this jig head works, right, is if my hand is the fish's mouth, that needs to be lined up with the point facing into the hook, fish's mouth, at the moment that you, quote unquote, set the hook, right, or that you pull and it comes tight. And you'll pull this, boom, and that hook goes in. You pull hard enough, you get penetration, and that's how it's hanging in there, all right? It's not how the circle hook works, right? And I'm sure everybody is at least somewhat aware of this, that, you know, it's not about, all right, line it up here and then jerk really hard. No. What you want to do, and I'm going to use, you know, this as my fish's mouth. You can imagine, theoretically, you could have that fish all but swallow this hook, right? It's one of the reasons they're required for natural baits, rather, in billfish tournaments. This hook can go down in there. You're not going to be hooking the stomach or whatever. That's not to say it's never happened, but it's very, very rare that you're going to hook a fish in the guts with a circle hook. So here we are. As I pull up on this, the way it works is I'm not going to be pulling straight away from the fish when I'm fishing very much, right? In fact, he's generally going to be picking up, he's going to be moving at some bit of an angle. So as this comes, it's going to hook around, right? And that little bit of, you know, the fish's lip here, right, is going to go in this. As it comes pulling out, it's going to come in here. And then once that lip, you get this around it, now all of a sudden you're cooking with gas, right? So this comes up, it peels around, and as it peels around and twists like this, boom, now you've got it. And then when that fish turns back the other way or whatever, that's how you'll see it, where his lip is all the way down in the bend of the hook. So, based on what I just said, this is, remember, the cinched up knot. All right, this particular one happens to be a clinch knot. Goes in, pulls. Goes in, that one I caught. Goes in, pulls out. Goes in, caught him. Goes in, well, that time my line got in the way, so disregard that one, but goes in, and then as I pull, boom, it pulls out. Now, what you'll note is that it needs to be able to orient itself so that the hook goes into the lip. If I pull this out, and because I've got a pinch knot on here, I could turn it theoretically so the hook was facing away from me. Boom, I pull it out. If I had to, I could sit here and pull this out of here across my finger all day long without getting hooked. Now, let's do that with this one. We've got a little loop knot. You can see that hook's free to move. Man, I could gently lay it across. Nope, didn't get it that time. I could gently pull it to where it doesn't hook my hand coming out. But because it's got that flexibility and the ability to move and turn, especially, you know, a fish is going to be holding on to it to some degree, it's going to be able to work its way around. That time I got it. It's going to be able to work its way around and find its way into generally the corner of the mouth. Occasionally you'll have them in the middle of the lip, but it's usually over by the corner, right? Because that fish is swimming away, it comes up, and boom, right like that. All right? Now, that alone shows you that in addition to the benefits of getting more freedom of movement out of a live bait or a dead bait fluttering, you have a hookup advantage with the loop knot as opposed to a clinch knot on that circle hook. Well, now let's talk about a snell, all right? The snell, you'll notice, even laying here, and you know, imagine underwater, right, where there's some buoyancy involved. This hook is kind of, it naturally wants to sit like so, right? It doesn't want to sit straight off the end of the line, like on this hook. So when I look at the way that this comes off, you can imagine that as I pull this out through my hand, look, pulling this string, or the leader rather, it pulls it and aligns the eye to where it wants to hook up every time. I'm unable, let's see, I might be able to do it here, but as I pull it up, nope, it twists. Every time as I'm pulling, you almost can't pull this hook across a finger or something backwards to where it doesn't hook it. Even if I line it up facing away, as you pull up, because of the way the line enters into the hook, this will 100% get you your highest hookup ratio. If you just go like this with a properly snelled hook and you pull the line like this, I'm telling you, 99 out of 100, right? You're gonna hook your hand, all right? I can't pull it and not have it come through where it ends up hooked, all right? So if you don't believe me, you're welcome to try this yourself. Snell it, send the line out the front the proper way, and snell one backwards with the line going out the other way. I've got a video on how to snell on my channel here. But go ahead, pull it through your hand 100 times, see what happens. I'm telling you, this is the way to do it. So for hookup ratios and whatnot, I'm really liking the snell, okay? When I would work as a mate on boats for billfish tournaments, this is what we were doing. We were snelling them with even some fairly heavy lines. Now, obviously, these are bigger hooks and whatnot, but when we were running, you know, whole mackerel, Spanish mackerel, skipping or swimming, as pitch baits, as hook baits, whatever, it was always a snelled hook out the front. You could go to a marlin tournament tomorrow where there's natural baits being used, walk up and down the docks, ask every mate to see their leaders. I'm telling you, 99% of them are going to be snelled, right? And the ones that aren't, honestly, are probably running too heavy of leader, really for the application, and they might even be crimping them because they can't tie a knot, right? Because they don't have the option to snell. So that is generally circle hooks. Most everything I just said equally applies for J hooks if you're using J hooks with natural bait. Obviously, it's not as pronounced with the circle, right? But with the J hook too, if you pulled this across backwards, you're not getting the max hookup ratio, right? You still want to be pulling it, right, where that hook point is going to be coming in. And if you look at some of the big hooks, you'll never see a big, you know, offshore big game hook or whatever, where that point is pointed away from the eye. These tuna hooks are very popular now. And what they have is that hook is kind of, that point is kind of pointing back towards the eye, right? And what you're doing there is you're aligning the way you pull, right? And it's almost working its way back towards a circle hook. Not quite, you know, the tip doesn't come in and it's not a, you know, as pronounced, of course, as a true circle hook, but just something to consider on that front. So that right there is my thought on tying hooks. For other terminal tackle, it doesn't really matter as much. The one thing I would say that I would consider is if you're tying to a swivel and you're going to be using something like a fish finder rig, where you're going to have a weight or maybe a swivel that goes to a dropper to a weight or whatever that's banging down against it, just make sure that the knot you choose is one that's going to be able to hold up to that, right? So there's some that are more fragile, less fragile, whatever, and that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. Go check out my other videos on different knots that I like for different applications, but that's something to consider there. So let's talk about different lures, all right? There's a million different types of lures out there. And again, we can't go through and I can't say, all right, every time you have a popper, tie this knot. Every time you have a spinnerbait, tie this knot. But I want to talk through kind of the ways and the reasons we think about things. So I'm going to start off with this paddle tail jig head, all right? When you're retrieving this lure, it's going to be a fairly straight retrieve. You're going to have the paddle tail kicking. But anyone who's fished a paddle tail a bunch can tell you that with different combinations, it's a little different, but a lot of times you're trying to get a little bit of a roll in that paddle tail, okay? And as you retrieve, yeah, this is kicking, but you'll have what some folks call a secondary action. So from above, try to get this kind of from above in the video shot, it'd be looking like this, right? And you know, that'll allow some of this flash to work more or whatever. To get that little extra bit, I really like a loop knot, all right? I don't see a downside to using a loop knot here. And that's generally what I'm going to be running if I'm running a jig head with a paddle tail, or really a jig head with anything. You want to get that little bit of extra motion. Again, having the additional weight here on a jig head, it kind of makes it more so. Remember we were talking about how with a real tight knot here, you know, you pull this a little side to side, it's pretty noticeable and it transmits real hard. Well, you can get away with a little bit more with the jig head, because especially if you're sitting it, maybe you're dragging something on the ground or on the bottom, or you've got a big bait back here or something, this isn't gonna be as susceptible to it. So that's a consideration, all right? I will also say there are other minnow types. So I've got one right here. This particular one has a weedless setup with an underspin, but especially with like forward-facing sonar and stuff, little soft plastic minnows are really popular in bass fishing, and frankly, they just work, right? I mean, this particular lure right here, gosh, I can hardly imagine, you know, an inshore or freshwater game fish that hasn't been caught on a, you know, lead head jig with a paddle tail, you know, just retrieved in all different manner and whatnot. Very versatile. So with these, same thing, especially as you're forward-facing sonar, a lot of these people are doing what's called shaking, right? And so they're shaking that rod tip, and you're just imparting a lot of weight. You can see technically this has a paddle tail, but it's less about the paddle and more about just kind of that long flexible tail. You want more of that motion side to side, you're gonna want that loop knot, all right? Now, interestingly, if you're running maybe a bigger paddle tail, something like this with a big spinner, you could probably get away, you know, with the cinched up knot if you're truly straight retrieving, but I just don't see a downside. You know, learning to tie that loop knot is pretty quick. It's incredibly strong. So I would recommend you learn that knot. That's a really good one for those minnow imitations. You got a frog, all right? Man, if you're not frogging for bass, you're missing out. What a awesome way to catch them. So if I am fishing this on mono or fluoro, or maybe braid with a mono or fluoro leader, I'm going to want that loop knot. Now, if you are kind of in the bass fishing world at all, you know that the vast majority of guys fishing frogs, especially pros or people who are real serious about it or real into gear and techniques, are doing it on straight braid. It is tougher to get a loop knot to hold perfectly with straight braid. Also, braid is not as abrasion resistant, okay? The flip side of that is braid is much more supple than a mono is, right? So a braid not having the memory that mono does, right, will allow you to get away with a little bit more. What I generally do, because I'm going braid directly on a frog, is I'll do a Palomar knot. Now, that's not to say other knots wouldn't work, you know, San Diego JM or something else, but Palomar is quick, easy once you learn it, and it works very well with braid. Not all mono knots work well with braid, but that one does. So you throw that on there, cinch it up, and then even though it's on braid, even though it's cinched down on the eye, it's braid. So you still have a little bit of that play, right, that you want. When this thing's sitting on the surface, you want it to be able to bounce around real hard with each twitch, all right? And that's actually worth noting. So let's say I'm retrieving this and I'm trying to walk the dog, right? That's a good application. If I'm trying to walk the dog on a stick bait or something, and I want it to bounce this way, then bounce this way, then bounce back this way, well, I don't want something where the lure is always going to be in line with how my leader is, right? Because if I were going to do that, now I've got to walk not just the lure, but the entire first few inches of leader. So anytime I'm trying to do any sort of walking bait or reaction like that, I'm going to be going with the loop knot. So there's my thought on the frog. All right, I've got a couple little glide baits here. So glide baits, you know, when you retrieve them, if you're not familiar, the way these work, you can do a real slow retrieve and they'll just swim a nice S pattern. And if you chop them, which is, you know, turns of the handle or sharp twitches of the rod, basically what you're doing is it'll be sitting like this and you jerk it and it'll twitch real hard and it'll swim off this way. And then it'll go back the other way. Same thing with the frog. If you want that thing to be changing directions, man, you need to give it the freedom to do so, right? And that's why I like a loop knot. I really like this particular, I don't think it's showing up real well on the camera, but you can see this thing is just super chewed up by fish. It's been a good lure for me. Always going to be looking at a loop knot on this, okay? Now, this brings up an interesting point. Why do we like the loop knot? We like it for the extra freedom. Some percentage of glide baits, pretty high percentage, will come with this split ring. This is also true of jerk baits. This is also true of a lot of walking lures, like a spook or some sort of topwater. Well, if it's got the ring on there, right, you're already getting that extra movement. I mean, look how much movement I've got here. I'm pinching this ring still, and it can still move. Well, if I pinch this still, yeah, the body can't move. Does that make sense? So I'm already getting the movement out of it. Now, the split ring, if you take a real close look at it, I should have had a giant one, but think of a key ring or something. You've got this split right here. It's going to be really tough for me to make show up on the camera, so take my word for it. But you got that split right there. Because of that, I don't like a loop knot, because that loop knot is going to be moving relative to the split ring, okay? And over time, that little cut right there, that's going to wear on the inside of that loop, okay? So I would highly recommend you avoid using a loop knot. I would recommend you use a cinch down knot, and I would recommend you intentionally cinch it down either across or 90 degrees perpendicular to where that split is in the ring, all right? I've heard some very good anglers say that they like going 90 degrees off of it. Whatever you do, tie that cinch, pull it tight there, then don't worry about it, all right? So that's glide baits. Basically, you want to make sure you get that freedom, okay? But you want to make sure that if you have that split ring, you're not opening yourself up to potential problems there, all right? That general approach, that's something that will cover a really wide array of lures. I'm talking crankbaits, I'm talking lipless crankbaits, jerk baits, a lot of topwaters, a lot of different stuff. I thought about bringing out a bunch to discuss, but I was like, man, it's basically all the same as what we're going to discuss on glides. So if you have a split ring, I would say that right there makes your decision for you. If you don't, I would recommend looking for an opportunity to use that loop knot. All right. A couple other examples. The popper. Same exact thing as what we discussed here. Some percentage of these poppers are going to have split rings, so be aware. But also, on this particular one, if you cinch it down, you are not only affecting how much it's going to move side to side, but if you truly cinch down on this, now when you catch a fish, you know, it'll slide on there, but you could affect the angle at which you pull. Does that make sense? If I cinched it down all the way up here, or I cinched it down all the way down here, you could affect the angle at which you pull this popper, and that's going to affect its action. All right, this happens to be a Megabass popper. I really like this one. It's kind of got the cuts through the, you know, front, out the gills and whatnot. If you want to, now you're going to want to check this every time, but really cinch down that San Diego jam or whatever, and then you can mess with pushing that knot all the way down to the bottom or pushing that knot up to the top, and that'll affect the angle at which you pull it, which necessarily will affect the action. If it's real choppy or something out, you're going to struggle to really see it, but just messing around, especially on a flat pond sometime, try it. Assuming you're not doing that though, again, I want this to be able to pop and work and fly all around. You know, I love if I can get a real aggressive pop and then it just kind of twists off to the side or whatever sits there. Anyone who fishes poppers a lot knows that You just be shocked by the number of strikes you get while it's sitting still. So as much flexibility as I can get there is awesome. All right. This is called a Megabass Mag Draft. This is probably one of the more common or most popular, really common big swim baits out there. This particular one is the 6-inch model. You can kind of tell, maybe not so well on the camera, but this thing's been chewed up pretty darn good. 100% of the time, I am throwing this with a loop knot. The exception would be, again, if you put a split ring on here. And for some baits that people are trying to tune or whatever, they'll mess around with putting on and taking off split rings because it'll mess up the weight, right? And so let's say they want to sink just a hair slower, not so much with the Mag Draft, but with like really neutrally buoyant lures like this, where just adding a split ring will make it maybe sit perfectly still or sink super slowly versus a float, especially different size and weight split rings. It's kind of a separate issue. But not only am I doing that, but the reason I have this one in particular to discuss is it's a good time to talk that when you are running loop knots, I highly recommend, and it's tough, man, when you're on a hot bite, man, you just want to get that line back out there. Turn that loop to the side and look. I lost a Mag Draft doing this, and I was just on a hot bite. I was fishing a big lure where every cast, and this isn't even that big of one, right? They make 8-inch and the 10 inches is huge. But I was fishing a big soft paddle tail like this, and I'm casting it as far as I can, right? So, pew, reeling it back in and ripping fish. You know, you're fighting them hard. They're thrashing all around. You know, the hook actually comes out of this, right? So you're fighting the fish from here to here, and this is bouncing every time they jump, whatnot. It's a whole thing. As I'm going, I probably caught, I don't know, 8 fish, 10 fish. Who knows? Just that one day on it. And I had not retied since the last time I was using it. Well, during all that, this was bouncing around, and it was wearing through right here on my fluoroleader. I was only fishing a 15-pound fluoroleader. Sure enough, had a big one, came up, jumped, comes off. Oh man, he spit the hook. Start reeling. Nope. He broke me off. How'd he break me off? I get it back. Literally, the knot is there. The 2 halves of the loop are there, and you could see where it had worn through right there. Just enough so that when he came tight on it, right, and pulled hard enough, pop, went right through there. So be aware of that. If you're running loop knots, keep an eye specifically on that. If you're running loop knots on something huge, maybe you're even crimping little loops at that point on something really big, for example, big tunas, which I've done a little bit of fishing for. A lot of times you'll see people putting a little piece of chafe tubing on there to protect it. Now, I mean, this is 25-pound mono. That's not at all the application I'm talking about. But in heavy circumstances, you'll see that. Don't let that be what loses you a fish sometime. Next up, I got a chatterbait. All right. If you're unfamiliar with these, as you retrieve, this blade will kind of sit back and it'll work almost like the lip of a crankbait or something. And this thing is very hard. Tunk, 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 thumping its way along. You can slow roll it, you can rip it really fast, but you can feel it. And your rod tip, you can be using the stiffest rod out there, and that rod's going to have a little bit of vibration to it. Because of that, this is not something like a little minnow, right? Or maybe a frog that's just like floating along gently and doesn't have a lot of force. There's a lot of force in this thing. And it's going doo, 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 doo. And some of them, especially if the big blade chatterbaits, I'll actually even put on intentionally like a bigger, thicker trailer to try to tone down the thump in certain scenarios. You'll also note that these have, some of them will have like a little snap swivel or something, but they'll have like a little twist of metal up here, all right? If you were tying loop knots and you're not super skilled with it or experienced, you're going to tie your first few like really big. They're going to be like comically large loops. Generally speaking, that's fine. This is a scenario where it might not be. One, the loop knots on here with the hardcore action, it's going to be similar to what I was just discussing with the Mag Draft, where you might get a little bit of wear, right? Because it's just the entire time on the base of that loop. So be careful of that. The other thing is if your loop's too big, right, and there's some slack in the line or maybe on a cast or something, that loop can get caught around the little wire twist here, and you could break off. More likely than not, it's just gonna, cause some premature wear and really hurt your action. Maybe take you out of the game for a cast or two until you snip and retie. Not the end of the world, but we want to keep our fishing time for fishing, right? So from that perspective, I'll actually usually cinch up on these. And then finally, most folks. All right, sorry about that. My camera ran out of battery. Guess I've been too long-winded here. So as I was saying, this is a spinner bait, and there's probably some people watching this right now who this was the first ever lure, right, that they tied on for a bass. These are super common, but you know, one thing in particular, and there's a handful of different lure styles like this, but you actually tie right onto here, okay? Well, especially while you're casting or working through brush or whatever, you know, maybe this thing falls down to the floor and you have to pick it back up. You want that line to stay tied on to this little area right here, okay? Now I've seen a few of these arms where they make a loop and come back down or whatever. If you have something like this, I highly recommend you do a cinch tie where it's gonna come all the way and hold tight there, just so that your line doesn't slide down here, slide up here. You know, if you cast it out and you start retrieving it and your line's snagged up in one of these blades, you're just wasting your time, right? And you have to sort it out when you get back to you. So I would recommend a cinched up tie on that one. So that more or less concludes just the basic thoughts I've got. What I did not talk about here was, you know, rigs or something along those lines. If you have questions on that or thoughts on that, or maybe you want to see a similarly in-depth video on crimps and how you make decisions while you're doing those, please let me know. I'm always happy to talk about different things, but you tell me, what did I get wrong? One thing that I think is really important for folks to remember is the second best knot for any application that's tied perfectly is way better than the first best knot that you didn't actually know what you were doing, right? Or that you kind of screwed up or whatever. So if you're tying a knot and things are going sideways, don't hesitate to just snip it off and retie, right? You don't want to lose your lure, but really you don't want to lose it when the big one bites, right? Which of course is when there's gonna be the most stress on that line, that knot. So that's how I think about it. Please let me know. You know, I'd love to engage in conversation with you. You know, if there's something I could explain in more detail, that'd be cool. I'm happy to make follow-up videos. So yeah, let me know. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good one. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Comment what you would like to see next. Thank you.